Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 4 o'clock session. I'm going to talk to 3 rather brilliant environmental activists. And I know in some ways all our panelists today have been environmental activists in some way or another. But these environmental activists are being activists through art in the most intriguing and extraordinary ways. Veronica, on my right, set up the Groundwork Gallery in King's Lynn in Norfolk. And if you don't know it, it's jolly well worth a visit. It's the UK's first and only commercial art gallery exclusively dedicated to environmental art. And to accompany the exhibitions that you also have symposiums with experts to educate audiences about the issues raised by the artworks. And in a sense, building up a different kind of groundswell of activism. And before Groundwork, Veronica was head of the Education Research and Deputy Director of the fantastic Sainsbury's Centre at the University of East Anglia. And she's worked in education and heritage and consulted on many national and international art projects, besides writing lots of books about art history, education, cookery. So, a veritable expert. Right, Kaitlin Ferguson on my right is a visual artist with an environmental focus, and her work focuses on geology, ecology, and what are called environmental humanities. And through her art, she aims to disrupt our human-centric viewpoints and reveal new ways, new readings of the environment, ones that seek to deconstruct and heal the deeply embedded divides between nature and the culture that surrounds us. Born in California, Kaitlin now lives in Norwich, the centre of all these environmental activists. She received a bachelor degree in fine art from Norwich University of the Arts, graduating with a first and in 2019 the Andrew Grant Scholarship. She received her master's from the University of Edinburgh, and she recently co-directed the short environmental film Living in the Ruins, which screened at the Edinburgh International Science Festival. Steve is an environmental dramaturge whose works are stage, theatre, radio plays that bring home the climate crisis by exploring the human layer of the phenomenon and revealing the complex interplay of the emotions triggered by it. His works include Song of the Reed, which you might have heard, the 4-part radio play on Radio 4, and The Contingency Plan, a diptych of plays about climate change that was at the Sheffield's Crucible Theatre this autumn. Welcome. You kind of know each other because certainly you two work together, don't you? How did that begin?
Well, we'd worked together already in the Sainsbury's Centre, but then when I started developing the extraction programme at the gallery and wanted some artists in residence and had to do it quite quickly, I thought, I know, Kaitlin. That wasn't because it was quick, because I knew your work was brilliant and you'd be very relevant. And I offered her a chance to spend a couple of weeks in residence because the gallery is on 3 stories.
Let's have a slide. There it is.
The top floor is a letting apartment, which brings in the money to pay for the gallery. So
that's a brilliant model.
You can all come. I recommend it as a live-work model.
So it's a sort of artist Airbnb?
Kind of is, yes.
Yeah.
And it's kind of beautiful and comfortable up there. And then the middle floor is multi-purpose, partly gallery, partly residency space. It's a bathroom and kitchen.
Yeah.
And then the ground floor is classic gallery, which we're not allowed to live in because of the rising potential water levels. The ground floor can't be used for accommodation. Potential rising water levels, I say.
Okay.
They haven't risen quite yet. But that's one of the reasons for founding it there, because it's in a floodplain.
Yeah.
And it had to be about the environment.
Yes.
One of many reasons.
Now, and we've got one more slide to come.
So this is...
Here's the inside.
Okay, there's a couple of exhibitions.
Yeah.
Bird After Bird with Jane Ivy-Me, looking at the birds on the red list. She made effigies of all of them in China. and this is the extraction. You probably see Caitlin's name up there.
Yeah.
So that was through an American initiative called Extraction Art on the Edge of the Abyss, which involved about 50 writers and artists and more than 100.
Tell us a bit more, because the word extraction doesn't really do it justice.
Well, from that origin project, they were activated because of the Berkeley pit in Montana, which was the residue from a copper mine, which was left as a huge, utterly poisoned lake and unprotected. So they were so exercised about it, this group of writers, that they founded a program. They went to see the local contemporary art museum. In fact, it was Karen, who's here, who got me involved with it, and she lives in Kings Lynn and is an artist I also work with. And said, you must get in touch with these people, and I did, and it turned out that Groundwork was the only European or non-American contributor to that program. They involved lots and lots of museums and galleries and artists. And so I decided to look at a local issue. At the time, I was working with Norfolk Coast Partnership and asked their advice about what extraction issues there were that we could think about. And they said, quarrying. They said aggregates, chalk, flint, and silica sand. And the most controversial was silica sand. And it turned out that just outside Kings Lynn is the biggest silica sand quarry in the country, supplying sand for 80% of the glass market.
What do they leave behind?
Sorry?
What poisons do they leave behind?
Well, in fact, it's relatively well regulated because our planning laws don't allow us to do what they do in the States and just leave it behind.
Yeah.
So each quarry has to spend 5 years restoring the land.
Yeah.
And they're varying to varying degrees. Some are better than others, but there's some good examples around in North Norfolk of quite well restored. And in fact, one of the things we learned is that I think 75% of triple SIs are in former quarries.
Yeah, fascinating.
Which was, quite fascinating.
So, Kaitlin, fill us in. But before we go on your broader work, how were you involved in extraction? Give us a sort of practical example of an activist who's an artist.
So, as Veronica mentioned, my practice was aligned with what she was doing and what the wider project was about. And so my interest really lies in geology specifically. And I'm really interested in a notion called deep time, which is thinking about time in terms of kind of planetary time. So 4.6 billion years worth of time. And as you mentioned in my introduction, just saying that kind of shifting us away. I think often in society we can think about time in terms of human-centric time, and it's say if perhaps we are lucky, we have 100 years on this earth. That's sometimes the lens in which we see, massive change and the planet, and thinking about that. And so with my work, I prefer to kind of look at geological time and how the planet's changing. And in particular, that is the perfect lens to kind of look at climate change within as well. And so it made sense, I think, with extraction was about geology in our area and in Norfolk. And so what I did is I was one of the residents in the first band of artists that Veronica brought in. And so Veronica and I kind of over the 2 weeks I had of the residency, we went to, I think I managed to squeeze in 6 quarries in 2 weeks and met some very lovely quarry managers. And I went in there with a preconceived notion that it was going to be this, really barbaric, really, and it's, it is quite startling what we saw, the scale of it as well. And a lot of these quarries are quite hidden from view, and roads that I have driven past for many years, I didn't realise the scale of these industries that happen. But what I think we both weren't expecting, as Veronica said, was to see these areas where quarries had been filled back in and to benefit of biodiversity in those areas. And we realised actually that these issues were incredibly complicated. And I went into that residency thinking I was going to, it was going to be activism perhaps in a more traditional stance of drawing people's attention to this bad thing. But actually it was really nuanced and it was really complicated.
Well, I'm interested, just going back to what you said in a way about time.
Yep.
Because one of the things we're looking at the moment in Suffolk is sizable C&D, and nuclear waste has a half-life of 25,000 years or something. In some ways, we're living in a human time where we can make decisions that affect multiple generations ahead of us in a way in which we never could before. And biodiversity is another element of this.
Yeah.
This is one of the least biodiverse places in the world
Yeah.
now, isn't it?
Yeah. And I think it was a way for me to like really focus on time, was a way for me to grapple with climate change. Like, it was when I was doing my master's, I wanted to really I did a course called Art, Space and Nature, which was all about kind of really getting into the hardcore science of actually what's really happening. And it was incredibly terrifying to be told by the scientists just how bad it was. And I can remember I said to my tutors, to paraphrase, what's the point of me doing anything? You know, I was in, and it was over time, kind of tutors taught me about this idea of eco-anxiety, and the fact that, and I think that's true for a lot of society, we're almost frozen with this massive issue, and or we kind of bury our heads in the sand about it. And so I wanted to find a way to grapple with it. And so I think time became a lens in which I kind of started looking at things through. And if we look at it through deep time, we kind of begin to see actually the Earth's in cycles, its cyclical nature of time. And it's James Hutton, who was a Scottish geologist in the 1800s, who kind of spoke about this kind of a lot initially. And we realise through deep time the sort of insignificance of us as a species, but also the significance of our actions. And I think it was you that said earlier about, like, I guess it's political time too. It's these 4-year runs and these try not to get into politics. But these decisions are being made for people to be voted back in 4 years' time. And it actually, the scale of changes we need is over a much longer period of time to save. I think it's the author, Rob Nixon, calls it slow violence, that this violence that's happening in the earth is happening over a very slow period of time relatively. So I think it's just a way I try and grapple with it.
Slow, yes, but in some ways also a short period of time, given the timescales you're talking about. I mean, we're talking about a sixth great extinction in the space of 100 years or whatever, which is, you know, a tiny blip in history.
Yep.
Steve, now, you approach it in an intriguing and different way because your work has got some of the greatest actors performing, or Oscar-winning actors and everything else, and you've managed to get them on radio plays, which is a really intriguing way, because I thought the first time I was aware of farmers beginning to understand about diversity of grazing was listening to the Archers. And you know, in some ways, people often say, if you're an activist and you want to change the world, when the Archers are dealing with it, you're on the way. You know, you're surfing the wave. And for people who are always frustrated that you can't get these things across, you're really on the front line of, well, it's important because Middle England, when it grips something, really does grip something. And I was at a meeting the other day and I heard that one of the people who are knocking on doors for political parties, you know, lobbying and trying to get people to vote and so on, one of the biggest issues at the moment on the doorstep is sewage in the water. And I'm intrigued. How did you end up getting into this place?
Well, I mean, like, I'm sure for everybody it's a long story and we don't want to spend all our time narrating that story. And I think it's really interesting to start with time, because I think drama, my medium, is extremely time sensitive, and it's all about now. I mean, Arthur Miller says, now is the most powerful word in the theatre. And so, I worked in the theatre for many years, but you called us activists, and I really appreciate the spirit of that, but I suppose there's a degree to which theatre is always seeking to elicit a response, an impact in some way. It might just be laughter, but clearly, it hopefully is more. And there's been a strand of work there which would describe itself as political theatre for a very long time, going way back to Greek tragedy. But I think you get trapped in theatres. And I suppose one of the things I was trying to do with Song of the Reed was to get into people's everyday lives. You're right that Middle England is permanently tuned in to Radio 4. It is like the soundtrack of Middle England. When they try and disrupt a single thing within Radio 4, there's practically a revolution. So to try and sort of hack that a little bit seemed quite interesting. And you're right to say also that you do that through collaboration. So, I mean, you were mentioning sort of Oscar-nominated actors, and presumably you're alluding to Mark Rylance. So Mark Rylance was in Song of the Reed. He played Ian, a kind of warden of a sort of nature reserve. But you see, Mark Rylance is passionate about these questions, right? So Mark will, if I may call him that, is quite prepared to set aside, very, very lucrative work to put himself right at the centre of this debate. And in a way, what's so fascinating when you've got somebody with got such strong values is that you're working with that energy. Also, Fionn Canedo, who played Liv in the series. So it's funny how suddenly radio drama, which frankly is an invisible form, let's face it, how many can you remember other than Under Milkwood that you've ever listened to in your life? It's like this continuous wallpaper of drama that goes out every 2:15 every single day. How do you manage to sort of make that somehow memorable, disruptive, joyous, right? Because it's not just about making people feel bad. And funnily enough, the thing that was really critical other than our cast was the structure and the way we put this piece out. It was seasonal. So it was 4 episodes. You can still listen to them on BBC Sounds. They
worth listening to, really.
And I think we had 2 really quite clear objectives. One is no studio work. So it was entirely recorded on location in Strumpshaw Fen, good old Strumpshaw Fen, just outside Norwich, even though it wasn't about that fen. And to bring those actors into that place is instantly a transformation.
Yeah.
The body in actual space, as opposed to in a studio space, which is the most artificial space you can imagine, is wholly different. So just the rhythms of people's performances, and also just the sound world, which was created by our wonderful sound designer, Al McGregor. He was doing natural history, I would argue. He was effectively recording exactly what was audible in those fens during 2021 to 2022. So much so that actually where he once cheated and he put in one sound effect, which actually referred to, I think, a kind of bird only located in the South America, there were kind of huge kind of speculations about what's happened. Is this an invasive species? And, because he just stepped away from that authenticity and it became a kind of record of the sound of that environment during those extraordinary years, because obviously in the background was COVID too. So, seasonal broadcasts in space, situ recording, big name actors, but also not big name actors, actually just local performers as well. So there's something about all of that disrupted that habitual relationship we have with drama and made it pop out.
Yes.
And it's just so much I feel now, and it's true of visual arts as well, is about how you design the experience of your work. For years I sort of resisted that and thought it's just about me being a good writer, whether I succeeded or not. But actually it is about the context.
Well, and another really interesting context is murmurations.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, whereas Song of the Reed will have been listened to by millions of people, and hopefully some of you in here too, Song of the Reed, Murmurations has been seen by approximately 150 people, and that's totally deliberate. So Murmurations is a completely different project I've created with a theatre company called Tangled Feet. And the whole idea about that project was to, in a way, responding to something that Caitlin's doing as well, to kind of work from place and to kind of celebrate conservation and nature reserves. Because obviously, we sort of take nature reserves for granted. They're deemed to be permanent fixtures in the landscape. Actually, they are all under pressure in extraordinary ways. And I live in Cambridgeshire, actually, as opposed to near Norwich. And our landscape is probably the most depleted natural landscape, other than Lincolnshire, in the world. And these little fragments and mosaics of fen remain, Wicken Fen, obviously we worked again with Strumpshaw Fen. So the idea was to produce a piece of theatre which took place in that environment without damaging that environment, because of course these are very sensitive environments. It was designed for 29 people, I think maybe 30, headsets, disco headphones. People were led into the reserves and then stories emerged out of the undergrowth. I cannot tell you how deeply it affected people. It was really, really interesting because it's quite a playful piece, but it does touch on really quite sort of strong issues about loss. Within the characters' lives, but obviously also the question of extinction, which you've raised. And our first run-through we did for the staff at Wicken Fen, who were, serious bunch of conservationists, and they came back to their visitor centre at the end of the hour or so of the piece, and they were all in tears. And actually, I felt horrified, actually, because it was such a sort of overwhelming reaction, but it was really, really interesting how, again, impact, what sort of impact are you seeking to achieve? And Murmurations now is trying to go to more and more environments across the country. It's kind of open to the specifics of place.
But it's interesting as an idea because, so many people go into museums and put the headsets on, and the whole idea of something provocative when you go for a walk into the countryside is intriguing.
Yeah.
Kaitlin, let's go and see some of your work. Here we go. Tell us a little bit about what we're seeing.
So this is... I guess it does what it says on the tin. The piece is called A Mountain in a Grain of Sand, and it's a Riso print. And so for me, this is a kind of representation of my exploration of deep time. So in this, I'm kind of using poetry as a way to explore the complexities of the rock cycle and kind of geology. And as I mentioned, these cycles of the earth, and thinking about that the earth is continuously eroding, but it's continuously building back up again. And so for me, I'm kind of using poetry as an entry point into quite a big notion. And then also, I can, in parallel to that, I also use scale as well as something I explore in my work. And so this is a kind of an image of a 3D scan that I've kind of done and processed it through so that it could be printed. And so I always remember Veronica said to me once, we were talking about my practice, and it really helped me kind of come to terms with what I do. And Veronica said, hopefully I paraphrase this okay, that I explore the microscopic as a way to try and process the monumental and share with others and open discussion out for others and communities about these monumental things. And so I would say I kind of use time and scale in that way. So
a bit of poetry, just like that. And then we've got one more, I think.
I think it's two more. So this one is called A Restless Earth, and it is a piece that I showed as part of the Edinburgh Festival, Arts Festival. And what it is it's two museum vitrines you can see in the centre of the image. The work behind is a separate work, but this work here houses 13 stones. And I worked with the University of Edinburgh's geology collection and picked out 12 different specimens from the history of the Earth, and different ones that represent different kind of geomorphological processes on how they formed. And alongside each one is a little card in the place where a museum label traditionally would be. Here, the vitrine, the label, the kind of red carpeted case that implies this visual language of the museum of hierarchy and ordering over nature. And that was really intentional, that you walked over to it thinking it was going to be that language. And here, actually, what poetry does is it disrupts that moment. And actually, each bits of these letterpress printed poetry are windows into the deep time of these objects and thinking about kind of what they really mean. Here at the top is a piece of Louisian gneiss, which is the second oldest, I think, rock in the world. It's from the Outer Hebrides, where I've done a lot of work. And what's incredible about this rock here is it's almost like a piece of plasticine that's been squished and contorted, and you can see the phenomenal amount of kind of earth forces that have created that stone.
Yeah.
And it's this, the notion of restless earth is something I drew from Robert Macfarlane's Underland, this idea that this restlessness of the earth always in cycles, like I'm saying, and I think restless earth kind of really represents that. But actually, probably the kind of most dramatic part of the work is actually there's a 13th stone, and it's here at the bottom right, and it's called a plastaglomerate. And this is now something that the Geological Society of America deem as a type of stone. And you might be able to tell from its title, it's actually formed from plastic. So it would be something that happens on the shoreline when somebody might have a campfire and there might be some discarded waste and the plastic is burnt. And it becomes a conglomerate where it kind of congeals with different sand and different sedimentary materials. And what's formed is essentially a marker of the Anthropocene, of this new geological era that we're in, which has come from human species tripping the Earth into the next kind of geological era. And so these plastoglomerates are incredibly horrific and terrifying, but also kind of really alluring as well, in this kind of strange way. Because I mean, this is what's going to be the marker of us in the strata in the future. You know, if we're thinking about what's going to be left behind.
Some chicken bones.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and so I guess that's what the plastaglomerate kind of sits. I think if the Louisian gneiss is the past, then the plastaglomerate perhaps is the future in that work.
You were going to say?
I wanted to actually shift slightly, and what I'd like to think about and talk about a bit perhaps is affect and impact. Because hearing Kaitlin and Steve both talking about their work and their relationship with audiences and with viewing, and the reason I'm doing what I do is because what they're doing is opening up a new world for us.
Or you're opening up a new world for them.
Well,
because that's actually how I was going to put it. Because what struck me about what I was going to ask you is that in some ways people think this is localized. But one of the most extraordinary things you've done is do a whole thing. You know, one of the biggest environmental panics in Asia at the moment is that the Japanese are about to release a vast ton of radioactive water into the ocean as a result of the closing of the nuclear power plant that got flooded. And you're in the vanguard of bringing artists you tell us all.
Well, there was an exhibition a year or so ago, 2 years ago, called Japan Water, and a group of artists who are actually based in London but with strong connections in Japan were thinking about, that overwhelming surge of waves, and that, the famous Hokusai wave, they're all obsessed, all Japanese artists are obsessed by. That was underlying the whole work.
That is Japanese art as far as we're concerned.
Well, indeed.
Isn't it? Yeah.
But actually, it was a metaphor for what happened as a result of the tsunami, that they're still dealing with the very troubling circumstances, and the troublingness is caused by some of the responses by government and building a vast wall along to stop the water further incursion, and now sending poisoned water back out to sea. And there are protest movements, and we had an event online which was actually one of the most affecting of all the events I've had, because we felt we were talking about something that some people were really able to affect and have an impact on. That was, and that's what I'd like to do a lot more of, and feel that we are maybe getting somewhere. We're building communities through the way we look at the world, through the way artists are showing us how to look at the world in new ways.
I think you're being a bit modest, to be honest. No, I really do, because actually, rather like what Steve's doing on Radio 4, these are the ways you affect change, because quite often information that comes at us in this, overwhelming way today of bad news and this and this and that, we have this sense, we can't concentrate on it and we can't get our head around it. And what your gallery is doing and what your projects are doing are giving people a chance just to pause and really, really think about things and really get it on board in their own head. And I think one of the things I want to ask all three of you in a way is that I think one of the overwhelming feelings that people have at the moment is a sense of powerlessness. And yet what you're doing is really, shifting things. How can we get involved in what you do? Because I think so many people just want to get involved.
Well, I mean, we were chatting about it earlier on. I mean, it's not in a way, my offer to audiences is to enjoy the work. And I think that one of the things that I find problematic, although inevitable in some respects, about thinking about art as activism is, do I want to experience the art? That is activism. When I go and pick up a novel, what is it that makes me want to read all those poems, all that film? It isn't necessarily because I agree with it. I feel like we have to sort of stay true to our forms, even if we create new contexts. Now, for me, theatre, drama, it's about pleasure. It's about humanity, it's about character, it's about laughter. It's really interesting you mentioned the contingency plan because, in fact, it was first staged in 2009. It was revived last year. There are two plays. One of the plays on the beach is incredibly serious and sad, and the other play, Resilience, is a Whitehall farce that goes pretty disturbing in its last moments. But that's the one I'm most proud of in a funny sort of way, because the first play writes itself, you could argue. The climate crisis is not fun. And it is deeply depressing, and it really, as you say, Kaitlin, kind of defeats agency to some extent. It's kind of so, when you take it in as a whole, it is terrifying. And we have to acknowledge that. And I think theatre's one place where we can acknowledge that, because actually a lot of the time we're trying not to think about that. But we also can laugh. And there's something very powerful about seeing an audience watching something that is, really quite scary, laughing their heads off. And so effect and impact are really quite interesting in that respect. And that's about traditional dramaturgical cares,
Yes.
structure,
and also,
laughter, and so on.
I mean, picking up on Caitlin's wonderful expression, climate anxiety, and I think that just, pins it very, very acutely, and particularly the younger you are, in a way. The older of us could sit there and think it's not really going to impact on my lifetime. But if you're young, to have to face that, it's far more horrific than us growing up with the fear of nuclear war or Cuba crisis or any of those kinds of things.
Yes.
And so let's go back to your gallery and your work, because in some ways, if you're faced only with depression, anxiety, all those kinds of things, in a way one wants to obscure and blank it out, whereas what you're creating is a thoughtful way of experiencing it and also experiencing the beauty around it.
Well, and the detail.
Yes.
I mean, what I always hope that at least what I might achieve is that people will go outside and notice the cracks in the pavement, and notice the change in the weather, or notice the stages of the way they go through their life, and what those critical moments are, and what things they can learn from and change. And I think a lot about art is about understanding change. And artists help us understand change. And that's, I think, also the other thing is we've got to talk more and discuss what we see. And again, a lot of the art world is kind of stereotypically silent, and you go to an opening and stand with a glass of wine with your back to the work while you talk to friends. Yeah. Well, actually, we should be looking the other way and talking about the art and what it opens up for us to discuss, and also how it relates to our own experience. Everyone has experience. That's why I actually love being in the gallery, talking to people. I've made so many friends through that. But because everyone has experience of the environment and has something they can talk about. And that's the beginning of a changing understanding. I mean, I don't know if the picture is still... Oh, there you are. There's the Richard Long mud drawing, which he made for the opening. And that was... so my first exhibition was Richard Long and Roger Ackling, and I remember the head of the art festival at the time asked me if I could spell the name Richard Long. And I realized one could not make any assumptions about famous people, my first bit of learning. But also, the stereotypical remark is people say, oh, did the builders throw their coffee at the wall?
Yes, yeah.
And that's the beginning of a conversation.
Yeah,
You see the river in a different way. That's the structure of the soil you're looking at on the riverbed. And it knew what it was. And that you can see scales falling from people's eyes when you say that, because you see this extraordinary soil structure. And when he made it, it was a kind of wet slurp, and then suddenly it revealed itself, and it knew what it was, and it was really moving.
Funny you should mention that. I was in Yorkshire recently, and I went to see a new Andy Goldsworthy thing that's opening there, which is somebody has allowed him to build on land within buildings to put his pieces, and you go on this walk. It takes about 3 hours, and it was one of the most moving things I've ever done. It was utterly extraordinary, revelatory, really.
I was just thinking about Veronica's point about behaviour in galleries, because what about behaviour in theatres? I mean, one of the things the reason I stick with theatre, and I'm not doing long-form television, although, the right offer came along, but, at the end of the day, pandemic essentially crowned the triumph of long-form television. So, Netflix sort of, shares went ballistic. Everybody is locked into their 10-hour, 8-season dramas. And in a way, it was a way of staying safe. And in a funny sort of way, it became this weird, meditative sort of space for drama. But obviously, every time that you get committed to those dramas, you don't go out. In fact, I find myself thinking, Jesus, do I need to go out? I want to watch television. So much more relaxing. And anyway, we haven't finished, we've got another sort of 10 hours to go. Now, when people go to an art gallery or to a theatre, they're rehearsing for other forms of public being that no longer exist. And one of the things that's really been shocking about the effect of the pandemic is we can see what happens when, it's like an experiment, 2 years not doing that, what happens afterwards? Guess what? People don't go back. Particularly older people, more frail people, regular audiences, they are not returning. And that's why today is so inspiring, actually, because, we have to really think about that because, what really annoys me about theatre is they go, watch a show and then go home. And every time that happens, it's a lost opportunity, isn't it, for a conversation. Theatre's put on maybe one question and answer session during, a month run. It should be one every night. And I think doing things like memorations, which you can't do with Radio 4. I can't keep popping up and, taking online chat. Whereas memorations, I'm with the audience, where we're all together and we're all talking. And I think that's, even if the work was rubbish, I think that's our role.
But it's really interesting because now both of you are academics as well and educators, and you've done an awful lot of academic and you're involved in that academic world. When I was talking with two farmers earlier on, one of their great lines was, we need to embed this into education. And actually universities, who've got the biggest resources of the lot, don't do that. And John Cherry was saying when he studied agriculture, it was fun, but it definitely didn't cover all of these crucial areas of regenerative farming and regenerative agriculture and so forth. How, given what you do, how can you bed back into the system a sense that every student gets exposed to this? And how, from a younger generation, as a more recent student, I'd like to. I kind of like to start with you because you're on the front line, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I actually want to chip in that I think there's another jigsaw piece to this that actually I think we're missing, and actually we're talking about. Obviously a gallery, we're talking about the theatre, we're talking about these art spaces where it's people who feel comfortable in art spaces in theory that are coming into. We're talking about a university, which is a very privileged space where people who can afford to either pay or take on that debt come to gain that academic knowledge. But a lot of my work is working with communities that are outside of these cultural or academic institutions. And actually my work is what I feel really passionate about in my social practice, working with people, is getting, and I think this is where artists are key, is finding out that knowledge from those academic settings and disseminating it out. Like the more work, I'm doing a lot of work about 3D printing, and this has come from the Extraction project. And what I'm interested in is taking that specialist knowledge and disseminating it out with communities. Because what I'm doing is taking waste and domestic waste, industrial waste, and teaching communities how to repurpose it into different materials. So I feel really proud. I think we also need to talk about what's this engagement happening in communities who aren't coming, who are actually perhaps might even be affected by climate change sooner than what we might be in these urban settings. I think we need to talk about outside of these institutions, what does education engagement look like, Well,
it's very interesting because I'm from the coast and it's a dynamic coast. It changes all the time. And yet staggering decisions are being made about it. And again, the kinds of people you're talking about in that local community can't really get a necessary understanding or a voice about it. And often they're told that the economics are crucial, the jobs are crucial, and that overrides everything. And I think that's extremely problematic.
And I think that's the key for arts, is that arts can come in and, when successful, empower communities and to bring everybody at the table for these discussions that ultimately will be affecting us all. And as you rightly say, it's younger generations who are going to feel this worse than potentially we are. And actually, so I feel really, it's like really important work for me to be able to empower those younger individuals to feel that they're able to feed into this, and that we're able to understand in those rural communities what are the nuanced problems they're facing, and find ways to be able to bring greater light and empower people's voices in these discussions for change.
But practically, how do you do it?
I think, well, I guess that's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
So the way that my work is site-responsive to a landscape, my social work is site-responsive to a community.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't take a prescriptive approach
No.
because that's not fair.
No.
So for me, when working with people, it's about who walks in the door, and it's about what that happens together, and actually it's about the collaboration between the artist enabling discussion, that the chat, and it might be through the lens of creative activity, but it could take many different forms.
Veronica.
There's one example I can think of where it's in the gallery, but we've encouraged, there's a mental health group, people who suffer from abuse, it ran out pre-COVID, but we're going to revive it, making things, repairing things. So it was about practical repair and mental repair, and physical activity, and sitting around the table, sewing together and making stuff. And it was there is a kind of recuperative aspect to
Yes.
making things more economically.
But I also think it brings new groups into the gallery who actually might be quite intimidated. I mean, if you come from the gallery world, you often forget how intimidating things are.
Yeah.
I remember years ago I used to make children's books, which own brand children's books for Tesco, and we discovered that we sold 1 million books in a year, and half the people, the research said they were too intimidated to go into a bookshop because just somehow or other it was just too scary. And I think we underrate all the inhibitions, and so many people feel it's not for me.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that in some West End galleries. I feel,
I mean, you couldn't say exactly the same thing about the theatre, can't you? You can say the same thing about Radio 4. I mean, it is hegemonically middle class, isn't it?
Yeah.
I work at University of East Anglia. I mean, universities are, from the outside they look like citadels of privilege. From the inside they look like sort of stress machinery. I feel an interloper that I always was a school teacher in the past and sort of got involved with higher education almost by accident through my writing. But I feel like the task is to make universities permeable. I mean, it's interesting, both Murmurations and to some extent Song of the Reeds were initially funded through streams of revenue that come through the Arts and Humanities Research Council. So I made a big grant application as if I were a proper academic to get that money to change my role in the sort of ecology of making work. So I felt quite pleased with that because in a sense that was a classic example of taking work.
I'm quite pleased with the system that it actually responded.
I was pleased with the system because actually it was quite a big ask from them to understand what I was attempting to do. But I think that there are streams of money there, that's where the privilege is, which are not necessarily getting to the public at all. And I feel like, universities should be permeable places. We should be constantly, there should be a flow of activity in and out of them, and they become gated communities. And that is a really big problem.
And as Kaitlin pointed out, kind of privileged communities too, compared to...
Yeah.
Now, it's time to hear from you. So, if we could have a little bit of light, and let's get some microphones. I can see an arm up there. The lady, there we go, in blue. Now I can see.
Hello, my name's Bridget. I'd like to mention a movement that I know Veronica knows about called Culture Declares Emergency, which I co-founded. And Culture Declares Emergency is about, enabling and encouraging the cultural sector to acknowledge and respond to the climate and ecological emergency, or Earth Crisis for short. And we've developed a framework, or I've developed a framework, where there are 8 pathways that help provide a sort of direction for the cultural sector to think about the value of their work. And it includes therapy as the situation changes and becomes more challenging, enabling the transition of local communities. It includes critiquing the system and helping to decolonize and work towards justice. It includes telling the truth and educating, and inspiring ecological design, and also kind of palliative curation and protection of our heritage. So my question is, do you, how much do you believe that that the cultural sector should be absolutely turning towards the response to the earth crisis as its absolutely kind of core function, or how much would you kind of qualify that, and what would you do towards that?
Well, can I respond? First of all, I don't think there are any barriers within the cultural sector. If you're a poet, if you're a playwright, if you're an artist, if anything, you're more likely to get help, support, encouragement in this area than in any other area, because it is so in our face. And I don't think that there are too many barriers at the moment.
There's a cultural barrier against really understanding the contribution cultures can make.
Yes, which is different,
it's the big missing voice in discussion, which is managed through specialism, through science, through engineering, through all the kind of, the specialist ways the climate is being dealt with. The cultural voice, we're going to overcome it through our culture, in the broadest sense of culture. And
do you think actually just that somehow or other the divide within our culture of science and art is actually being closed by this issue?
to some extent.
I keep thinking of Hegel, very pretentiously, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk. There's a degree to which, I was talking to lots of glaciologists when I was writing the contingency plan, what's so notable is they're thrilled and terrified at the same time, because the level of money, knowledge, energy going into understanding the dynamics of glaciers has never been higher.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're disappearing in real time. But the gear has never been more, set up for it. So there's this fascinating, I agree, there has been this amazing convergence, actually, between the arts and the sciences. It's still a problematic relationship. We have to acknowledge that. I think you're right to say...
But Kaitlin is blending art
Absolutely.
and geology
Yeah.
in a way in which culturally would have been very hard to do 50 years ago.
Well, I agree,
Yeah, and I have found that. And I found that hard, but that has come through, banging on doors and trying to get that specialist knowledge and trying to find the right academics, experts to collaborate with, because I think what art does, and I think I was kind of thinking about when you were speaking about this too, is their entry points, their portals into these issues that could be really overwhelming, but they're a door for somebody to enter into that discussion, to think about these things. And to come back to your question, I just feel like I can't make work about anything else. Like it's such. There's no greater issue. In my mind, I can't make work about anything else because of the scale of it, how monumental this issue is. So I think that's what motivates me to try and get to those places of knowledge and find that out, so I can disseminate it, whether that's through traditional work in a sense, or whether that's working with communities and engagement. It just feels it's our call to action. There's no greater thing to make art about right now,
Yeah.
But everyone in this room should join Culture Declares Emergency.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's doing a really brilliant job to make the voices bigger and bigger, which is what we need to do. And there needs to be much, much better collaboration. We should all be working together.
Thank you. Thank you also for setting it up, because so often, we end up going to things and we get all fired up and we don't know where to go. So that's marvellous. Next question, this gentleman over here.
Hi. Having I guess been reverse fly tipping with Kaitlin, I appreciated the introduction as an activist. I guess we don't have a contemporary word for shaman, but I think artist, activist, educator would come quite close. So I think it's the role of artists, creative people, to imagine unimaginable futures, to explain complex. How can you explain deep time if not through artistic practice? But actually, increasingly, and perhaps eventually our only role might be just beauty. And could you perhaps speak a little bit about that? And it's almost cool again to do something beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, and the ancient Greeks, truth and beauty, in some ways nothing's changed, has it?
I think that's a brilliant word, beauty, because obviously in aesthetics, if you go right back to the foundation of that philosophical discipline, it's about disinterestedness. looking at the world from a distance. But actually, the climate crisis says, what you care about is dying in front of your eyes. So actually, you've never before had to fight for beauty as we have to now. So in a way, art's very well placed to take that fight, isn't it? Doesn't mean it'll do it well, but the sense is that if our priority is aesthetic beauty in whatever mode we work, then hopefully we're part of that conversation, even if the work is not ostensibly about the climate crisis. So yeah, I think that's a lovely rallying cry.
Though there was a work I was telling you about earlier by Darren Almond that I've shown twice now I've shown it in Extraction, and it's terrifying beauty. He went to the Arctic and photographed forests that had been shredded to sticks by terrible pollution from the world's largest nickel mine owned by the Russians, and he can no longer go back there because it's too dangerous. And you look at these exquisite pictures and think, these are very beautiful, but there's this terrible story behind them, and what do we do?
But that's what you're pointing about. That's the power. I'm thinking of Sebastian Salgado black and white photographs in the gold mines, was it in Brazil or somewhere, and these incredible images of thousands of people and the horror of what was happening. But at the same time, it was shrouded in beauty.
Yeah. Well, it's the sublime, isn't it, to go back to that old adage. But I think also beauty sounds rather rarefied, doesn't it? I think that we have to be quite rough and ready. I think, again, this goes back to, you said earlier on, William, it's easy now to do this kind of work. I know what you mean. The Arts Council have prioritised easier. Everyone seems to be looking for it. But in all honesty, you have to really know why you're doing it and to what end. And I think there's a lot, potentially, of bad work because it's an emergency. Emergency means we panic. We feel we need to get the work out quicker. We need to kind of harvest reaction quicker, but that isn't necessarily how art works. And I think we have to acknowledge that contradiction, that we have to honour the craft as well as seek the response. And I think Keats said something brilliant. He said, we dislike a palpable intent. So as soon as somebody, you pick up a poem and it says, I want you to think this, you put the poem back down again. And I think that we have to honour our forms, and that's another way to beauty, isn't it?
Or as Andy Warhol put it, art? I thought that was a man's name. Time for one more question. Anybody else? Up the back there. Can we get a microphone up there?
Hello. I was just interested in the activism side of art, and also what you were saying about the reaction and the impact. I was wondering if in each of your own experiences of theatre and galleries and your own artwork, how you have over the years measured that impact. Do you feel like you've made a change through your artwork, and how did you sort of find out whether you've created an impact?
Quick response from the three of you. Who's going to start?
I'm not.
Well, I've got a book full of responses, which
Yes.
are reactions, but I suppose there's been one tangible thing that, as a result of an exhibition I had about trees, the council established a strategy for trees, tree planting in the town.
Yeah.
So, it had a direct impact there. And that I'd quite like, to do more of, to try and have concrete changes in society through politicians.
I think it's a bit unfair to ask artists about the impact, but I know that BBC Radio 4 have seen a staggering impact from your work in terms of what people are saying and everything else. And I don't know, but I'm pretty convinced that you would have an enormous impact on what you're doing, just seeing your work, Kaitlin.
But I think, to come back to scale again, I think impact happens in so many different ways. And I've got countless times and anecdotes of personal connections with community members, or, for example, taking really young children from in challenging areas to see their first ever open body of water, and to be able to support them in exploring nature and seeing new things that they've never seen before. And that's incredibly kind of emotional, amazing impact. And I've seen that change for that individual. But you could also talk about, we need that emotional connection for people and to support people in exploring that. But we also need to be part of policy change. We also need to be part of, the government changing and how we vote and these things. And I think, impact has to happen in so many different ways. And it's a really interesting
But
question.
you're stimulating it with your work.
Yeah.
And I'd just like, to close the session by saying these three people are passionate innovators and warriors for change. They're on the front line, and they're the people who are really going to change all of our minds. And that's the most important thing. Veronica, Kaitlin and Steve, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.